Darwin, Australia, 1942. It's an almost perfect day, barely a cloud in the sky as you stroll along the wharf towards the huge ship up ahead. You're a wharfie at the Port of Darwin, and after days of strikes, you are finally going back to work. The harbour is packed with ships that need to be unloaded. Some have been waiting for weeks. But before you start the hard graft, it's time for a smoking break. As you troop into the tin recreation shed and light up, your mate Charlie starts mouthing off about the war. "I don't know why they keep nagging us to stop striking. The Japanese will never get past Singapore. It's a fortress, everyone knows it. And they have such small eyes, they can't hit anything." You burst out laughing. Tell that to the Yanks at Pearl Harbour. Charlie glares at you as he pulls up his collapsing trousers over his fat belly. He's about to reply when a loud, droning hum fills the air. Looking outside the smoky hut, you spot a fleet of aircraft heading towards Darwin, the sun at their back. Charlie laughs and yells out, "Must be Yankee reinforcements, at last." You go outside to get a better look at the aerial armada, and it's then that you see the flaming red meatball symbol on their wings. Those are not American planes. Before you can scream out a warning, a Zero fighter dives down and rakes the wharf with bullets. Forcing you to dive to the floor. Charlie's face stares out from the hut doorway, looking terrified. But then, Charlie and the hut disappear in a shower of rubble and a flash of red and yellow flames. Where the hut stood is now just a smoking crater. The ship you're unloading is filled with TNT. It's basically a floating bomb. You have to get away. But then the whole wharf shakes as two bombs slam into it, cutting you off from safety. The anti-aircraft guns open up as the Japanese fighters strafe the harbour and the bombs keep raining down. Your one chance of escape is the sea, but it's filled with oil, and parts of it are on fire. With no choice, you leap into the inky blackness, the wail of the air raid siren echoing in your ears. For the first time since Europeans came to Australia, that vast country is under attack by a foreign power. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
damals uns ausgebildet und wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. In this podcast, which is its early days, I was talking about it with an Australian I met in a bar during a night out. He told me he vaguely remembered that Australia was bombed by the Japanese in World War II. Maybe I could do an episode on that. Took me a year to get round to it, but I was really surprised by what I discovered. Australia's day that will live in infamy, its own Pearl Harbour. As the Japanese juggernaut overran Southeast Asia, the eyes of the Empire of the Rising Sun fell on the Australian Port of Darwin. What followed was a devastating air raid, a tale of individual heroism and massive official incompetence. Most of all is a story of the unthinkable happening, and a whole city having to live with the consequences that World War II has finally reached Australia's shores. In 1941, Australia had been part of World War II since the beginning. Its soldiers were winning plaudits for their heroism and toughness in the deserts of North Africa, while rationing was in force at home. Yet for most Australians, the war seemed very far away. The average person in the streets' views about the war was so blasé that the government was actually running a campaign to try and make Australians take the war more seriously, with little success. If the war seemed far away to most Australians, then there was one place that seemed even more remote: the city of Darwin. To explain, the majority of the Australian population lives along the eastern and southeastern coasts. This is where the famous cities of Melbourne and Sydney are. That's where the government is. It's the centre of Australian life. Darwin, however, was in the northwest, a vast, sparsely populated, isolated region, barely connected to the rest of the country. If most Australians thought of it at all, it was rather like how Mos Eisley in Star Wars is portrayed, a hive of scum and villainy. This was unfair, but Darwin was certainly a wild place in those days. A subtropical city clinging to Australia's remotest coast, it was regularly demolished by cyclones and had to be rebuilt afterwards. With only about 6,000 inhabitants, they lived in mostly ramshackle wooden houses, lining mostly unpaved streets. It was truly cut off from the rest of the country. Railway lines were few and only local. The roads were unpaved and impassable during the rainy season. Just one telegram line connected it to the wealthy east. Darwin's only lifeline to the world, indeed its only reason for being, was its port. It was ruled like a colony, all powers in the hands of the slightly sinister-sounding administrator, appointed by and solely responsible to the Australian government in Canberra. They could elect one member of Parliament. They didn't have the right to speak or vote. They just sat there like part of the furniture, doing nothing. Yet Darwin's days as a remote, forgotten backwater were about to change. The war that had started in Europe was now spreading to the Pacific. With the Wall Street crash and the resulting Great Depression, democracy in Japan failed, and the powerful military increasingly took over the government. Their solution to Japan's problems was aggression. Their country needed a vast empire, just like the ones ruled by the Europeans and America. Captive markets for Japanese goods and sources of raw materials. After first becoming bogged down in a never-ending war in China, Tokyo became ever closer to Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. As they moved into French Indochina, taking advantage of France being occupied, tensions with the US reached boiling point. America cut off the vital oil exports to Japan. Suddenly, Tokyo faced a hard choice. Either they could compromise and back down, or they could expand the war and seize the resources of Southeast Asia, taking on the mighty United States and British Empire in the process. In the most fateful choice in Japanese history, the military leaders picked war. The legend of Pearl Harbour endlessly requires that the Pacific War began with the first bomb falling on Wheeler Field, Hawaii. Not so. The Pacific War began on the 7th of December 1941 Hawaiian time, all right, but not at Pearl Harbour, and not even in the Hawaiian Islands. The first Japanese shots were fired not at Americans, but at British and Indian troops in northeast Malaya. An amphibious landing force of the 25th Japanese Army poured ashore at Kota Bau on the northeast coast of Malaya at about 12:45 a.m. on the 8th of December, 70 minutes before the first bomb hit Wheeler Field. The Japanese attack was not confined to Malaya. They struck simultaneously on an audaciously huge front extending from Hong Kong in the north to Singapore in the south. 3 hours after the landing at Kota Bau, at 4 a.m. local time, Japanese bombs rained down the supposedly impregnable British stronghold of Singapore, killing 61 people and injuring over 700. Next to bear the brunt of Japanese military wrath was Hong Kong. At 8 a.m., 36 Zeros struck Kai Tak airfield, while 3 battalions of Japanese infantry, supported by 3 brigades of mounted artillery, swept across the Sam Chun River and poured into the colony, heading for Kowloon. Just 9 hours after Pearl Harbor was hit, Japanese planes struck the American-controlled Philippines, wiping out over half its air force and leaving it defenseless. The American bases at Guam and Wake Island were soon attacked as well. Pearl Harbor, as tragic and dramatic as it was just one part of a vast surprise attack stretching across the Pacific. In the space of just 24 hours, the whole Eastern Hemisphere seemingly lay at the mercy of the empire of the rising sun. Australian policymakers had always been fearful of an invasion from the north, with China, the Soviet Union and Japan as a rotating gallery of potential villains. Now, though, this ancient fear was about to come true, as Japan hungrily eyed the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. If they captured these, they would be right on Australia's doorstep. At 11 p.m. on Thursday the 11th of December, 3 days into the Pacific War, Darwin's air raid sirens wailed in earnest for the first time. Thankfully, it was a false alarm. The only damage was caused by a soldier lobbing a brick through a lingerie store window to knock out a light that had been left on. This didn't stop Radio Berlin claiming the city had been bombed into the ground, though. At the time, it caused much mockery in Australia. Little did they know, the Germans were just 3 months too early. Darwin was already being transformed by the war. For now, no one thought it would be on the front lines. The Japanese were meant to be stopped by the so-called Fortress Singapore. Surely that can never fall. And the Americans under Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines would defeat the Japanese, no problem. But just in case, Darwin was becoming a massive resupply base for the defence of the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia. Ships were pouring in loaded with supplies. There was a problem, however. Darwin was in no way ready for its sudden importance. Despite being totally reliant on the sea, it had one of the worst ports in Australia, if not Southeast Asia. It had only one wharf that could unload just 2 ships at a time. Even pre-war, it could take forever for ships to unload their cargo, and now demand had shot up. On top of a poorly designed port, Darwin was also plagued by its strike-prone dockers called wharfies. Throughout the war, Australia was plagued by its militant unions. When it came to a choice between facilitating the war effort or downing tools, they knew where their loyalties lay. They struck, and struck again. And Darwin's wharfies were the most militant in the whole country. Scarcely a day went by without some sort of trouble on the wharves or a wildcat strike. It became a standing joke in the town. Whenever anything ran short, it could always be explained with the phrase, quote, "It's still the ship. Blame the wharfies," end quote. Large convoys took weeks to load and unload, and ships piled up in the harbour, while the whole creaking system failed to deal with them. Darwin became a serious bottleneck, blocking the flow of men and equipment northwards to the fight. It also turned the port into a target-rich environment that rivaled Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor. Wartime Darwin needed a skilled, tactful, and energetic administrator as problems built up. Sadly, he got Audrey Abbott instead. He would become one of the main villains of the upcoming raid. The administrator position for Northwest Australia was used as a place to dump past their prime politicians, a remote posting where they could cause little damage or embarrassment. That pretty much summed up Abbott. He was out of favour after playing a leading role in the New Guard, a loony right-wing paramilitary group that was as near as Australia ever came to a fascist movement. Tucked away out of sight in Darwin, Abbott behaved like a particularly arrogant British colonial officer sent to darkest Africa. He made no effort to hide the utter disdain he had for the city's population, openly calling them riffraff and scum. He refused to mix with them, only spending time with his land-owning cronies. His great obsession was to destroy the city's flourishing Chinatown, ranting in a letter to Canberra that the Chinese were, quote, "undesirable elements, which Darwin has suffered from far too much in the past," end quote. Soon the city despised him right back. This was the man within whose hands the safety of Darwin rested, and he wasn't up to the job. Abbott managed to completely botch the evacuation of Darwin. One poor group were given only an hour's notice to go to the harbour and get on the good ship Zealandia. The journey began with the guards throwing overboard any bags weighing more than 35 pounds, which was most of them because the people hadn't been told in the first place that that was the limit. Zealandia had been used for transporting troops to Darwin from the south and had not been cleaned for months. Food and water ran short. Toilet and washing facilities couldn't meet the demand of so many evacuees, and many had to do their business in buckets and throw it overboard. Some cabins designed for 4 people were occupied by 11 instead. The poor Chinese were forced to sleep on the open deck, as Abbott told them they were lucky to be included at all. As horror stories filtered back home, Abbott's relationship with the citizens he ruled plunged to even lower levels. The evacuation was so chaotic and record-keeping ridiculously patchy that no one was quite sure who had actually been evacuated to where. As Abbott botched his first test as a wartime leader, the war in the Pacific was going from bad to worst. Hong Kong surrendered. The British were in headlong retreat in Malaya. Japanese forces were pushing into Burma. Wake Island and Guam were overrun, and the Philippines invaded. Then, in January 1942, the Japanese landed in the Dutch East Indies. It's important to realize just how quickly the Japanese blitzkrieg was unfolding. We are just 5 weeks into the Pacific War. Empires that had sometimes taken centuries to build were collapsing in just over a month. An unprepared Australia suddenly found Japan on its doorstep. As the seemingly unstoppable Japanese onslaught continued, and port after port fell to their armies, Darwin was only becoming more important to the Allies. A new command structure had been put in place, the ponderously named American, British, Dutch and Australian Command, ABDA for short. The Port of Darwin was designated its main supply base. The formerly remote city now also became critical to the transfer of Allied fighter aircraft to Java. Without these air assets, Java would fall to the Japanese, and with it, the entire Dutch East Indies, with its vast oil and rubber resources that were crucial to the Japanese war effort. As the Allied build-up continued at Darwin, the Japanese noticed. After tearing through the Allied defences like a knife through butter, Tokyo was debating its next target. India, the Hawaiian Islands, and Australia were all on the table. As the debate raged on, the impasse was finally broken by the legendary commander Minoru Genda, a brilliant naval staff officer and one of the chief architects of the Pearl Harbour attack. He advised Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, quote, "Darwin poses a threat to current and planned operations in the Netherlands East Indies, and recommend it should be the first target. There has been a substantial build-up of enemy army and air forces in the area, and do not want it to be used as an offensive base against us." End quote. Genda had just painted a massive target on Darwin's back. Yamamoto's first plan was for a full-on invasion of Darwin to eliminate the threat. It was only the reluctance of the army that stopped it from going ahead. While Japan could never have conquered all of Australia, Canberra was lucky that some of its northern areas weren't occupied. That would be a good alternative history novel, Life in Japanese-occupied Australia. Since an invasion was now out of the question, Yamamoto decided there was only one solution to this problem. He turned to Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, who commanded the carrier task force Kido Butai. This was the very same carrier force that had just shown its brutal effectiveness in the bombing of Pearl Harbour. He would now turn his elite pilots on the Port of Darwin. Danger was coming. Yet the authorities back in Darwin certainly didn't act like it. They had just abolished the air raid wardens. That's right. Like so many of the city's problems in this period, it was due to Administrator Abbott. He had fallen out with the judge of the Northern Territory, Mr. Justice Wells. The good judge was a true Liberace of the law, loving nothing better than getting his name in the papers and tweaking the tail of the government. To get back at Abbott, he passed a ruling claiming the air raid wardens had no legal authority. The citizens of Darwin could ignore them. The ARP wardens were already deeply fed up with a perceived lack of support from Abbott, After the ruling, they effectively mutinied. They demanded that Abbott either publicly back them or they would resign en masse. When no word came from the administrator, they disbanded. On the eve of the worst air raid in Australian history, Darwin had no air raid wardens, and its civil defence strategy was in ruins. Well done, Abbott and Judge Wells. Well done. The Darwin authorities in general seemed determined to make the raid as easy as possible for the Japanese. Rather than spreading out the ships waiting to be unloaded across the port, the 45 ships were packed into a comparatively small area in the centre. Sitting ducks generally display more common sense and more instinct for self-preservation. A Royal Australian Air Force base had finally been built, but in the worst place possible. It was so close to the coast, with no working radar to give advance warning, that an attacking enemy would be on top of the base before anybody had time to call scramble. Original plans for defending Darwin had called for 250 fighters. Instead, they had 10 Curtiss P-40B Tomahawk fighters, led by Major Floyd Slugger Pell. Only 240 short. On the 15th of February, 1942, the aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soru, and Hiru left Palau and headed south for the Banda Sea and Darwin. They were escorted by the battleships Hie and Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers, Tone and Chiguma, the light cruiser Abukuma, and 9 destroyers. This was essentially the same force that attacked Pearl Harbour, reduced only by the absence of the 2 of the aircraft carriers, Tsukaku and Shokaku. The symmetry between Darwin and Pearl Harbour is almost too perfect to be believed. Around dawn on the 19th of February 1942, Nagumo's carrier force was just 350 kilometres northwest of Darwin. The 4 aircraft carriers turned away from the town and into the northwest wind. The flight decks became a turmoil of blue smoke and bellowing engines as 36 Zero fighters, 71 Val dive bombers, and 81 Kate horizontal bombers manoeuvred onto the launch catapults. A total of 188 aircraft took to the skies. 5 more than in the first wave that attacked Pearl Harbour. It's hard to believe the raid on the US Pacific Fleet had only happened 10 weeks ago. That's how fast events were moving. In the Port of Darwin, the docks had been out of action for a couple of days due to wildcat strikes. While the wharfies were going back to work that day, they were still on a go-slow. As they sauntered to work, their most urgent task was to unload Neptuna, whose hold was full of depth charges and explosives. Some foreshadowing there. Meanwhile, at 8 a.m., 2 American Catalina planes took off and went their separate ways, scanning the skies and seas for enemies. They were mainly looking for Japanese submarines, which was probably why the plane flown by Lieutenant Thomas Mora was taken completely by surprise. 9 Zero fighters descended on the slow-moving Catalina and raked it with bullets. The aircraft smashed into the sea, and the crew piled out into a rubber dinghy. They wouldn't be picked up for over an hour. The first opportunity to warn about the Japanese attack had been lost. The second opportunity to raise the alarm came as the Japanese planes flew over the Tiwi Islands. 2 coast watchers were stationed here, Father John McGrath on Ngui and Lieutenant John Gribble at Melville. Gribble saw the aerial armada first and would claim until his dying day that he radioed it in a warning, but was ignored. It wasn't until 2001 that the truth was uncovered. A brother Bennett, who was with Gribble on that fateful day, claims he urged him to radio a warning, but Gribble refused. He seemed nervous and unsure, claiming the message would have to be sent in code, and he didn't have the necessary code books. The second opportunity to raise the alarm was lost. Thankfully, Father McGrath was made of sterner stuff. He immediately radioed Darwin that, quote, "an unusually large air formation bearing down on us from the northwest," and, quote, "Nice one, Father." Sadly, it was for nothing. His warning was ignored. Back at base, The operators thought he was describing the 10 Kitty Hawk defenders of the city who were returning to Darwin after aborting a flight to Java due to heavy rains. All 3 chances to raise the alarm had failed. Obliviously, the citizens of Darwin went about their daily routines, while the wharfies very slowly unloaded ships. It was 9:55 a.m. The 10 Kitty Hawks had split up into groups of 5. The first group landed to refuel. The other 5 remained in the sky of Darwin. Suddenly, they noticed planes slicing through the air towards them, the red meatball of the rising sun on their wings. "Zeros! Zeros! Zeros!" you scream into your microphone as the enemy planes dive towards you, guns blazing. Instinct takes over, and you climb up into the sky, firing back. Ruining a Zero's attack dive as it frantically tries to avoid your bullets. You see one of your comrades' planes on fire as it plunges towards the sea. There are so many Zeros. They seem to be everywhere. You count 17, 18, 19, 20. This is a full-on air raid. You shout into your microphone. We need to get into the cloud cover to have any chance against so many. You're trying to follow your own advice, where you spot another of the Kitty Hawks beginning a steep dive, black smoke billowing out of it. A Zero comes at you again as bullets ricochet off your plane. But by the grace of God, it's not enough to down you. Finally, the clouds fold around your fighter and you're hidden from view. This really happened. It was the experience of Lieutenant Robert G. Ostraker. He was the only experienced airman among the 5. The rest were beginners. Yamamoto had insisted on using elite pilots for the Darwin raid. The Zeros were filled with the veterans of China and Pearl Harbour. Many were already aces. Outnumbered and outskilled, it was no real contest. While Ostraker reached the safety of the clouds, the rest weren't so lucky. Lieutenant Jack Perez and Lieutenant Elton S. Perry were shot out of the sky and killed, plunging into the bay. Lieutenant William Walker was attacked and badly wounded in the left shoulder. Landing a plane one-handed is no mean feat, but somehow Walker managed it. He put his Kitty Hawk down safely at the military airbase, scrambled clear, and watched as his plane was strafed and burned by the wheeling Zeros. Lieutenant Max Wicks had his plane badly shot up and parachuted to safety. He landed in the harbour, was swept out to sea by the huge Darwin tide, and did not reach land until after dark. Ostraker was left alone to take on 36 Zeros, 71 Vals, and 81 Kates. Despite the odds, he gave a good account of himself, shooting down 2 Japanese dive bombers, the first aerial victories by the Allies over Australia. After he landed at 11:45 a.m., his plane was being repaired, where it was destroyed by the second Japanese air raid of the day. He spent the rest of the 19th hunkered down at the bomb-ravaged airbase. On the ground, the 5 Kitty Hawks that were refueling heard Ostraker's warning and tried to take to the skies in support. Spotting approaching enemy fighters, Major Pell was rolling down the runway, where he was strafed by Zeros as his plane lurched 80 feet in the air. Pell parachuted out and hit the ground, injured but still alive. As he tried to crawl away, he was machine-gunned and killed by the Zeros making another pass. Following Pell was Lieutenant Hughes. He never even got off the ground. He was strafed as he gathered speed and crashed, dying in his cockpit. 21-year-old Lieutenant Robert F. McMahon managed to take off, and the next few minutes found him dueling with scores of Zeros over the harbour. Wounded in his leg, his aircraft's engine on fire, he had to eject, landing in the harbour alive after being machine-gunned by the Japanese as he helplessly floated in the air. Lieutenants Bert Rice and John Glover made it into the air. Rice was shot down and machine-gunned by Japanese Zeros as he swung below his parachute. Seeing Rice's predicament, Glover sought to protect his helpless comrade. In doing so, he downed a Zero fighter before his own plane was critically damaged by enemy fire. Crashing into the airfield, Glover miraculously survived the enemy strafing that followed as he walked away from the wreckage that had once been his aircraft. Rice landed in a swamp and was found several hours later. The defence of Darwin was now reduced to just the Army's 16 3.7-inch heavy AA guns and their untested gunners, plus some largely useless Lewis guns tied to saplings. The 81 Cape bombers divided up into two groups, one to attack the port, while the other pulverised the airfield. What followed was a living nightmare. One American survivor later wrote, quote, "No single incident in my life has affected me more than that raid. A disaster of magnitude and ferocity that is hard to describe. When it was over, had anyone told me that the war was to last another 3.5 years, I would never have expected to see it end." End quote. Bombs slammed into the wharf, ripping out a huge section, cutting off the wharfies who were unloading the Neptuna. As we saw in the opening dramatization, another bomb fell on the recreation shed, blasting it out of existence and killing instantly a group of wharfies who had knocked off for a smoking break a few minutes earlier. The surviving wharfies and ship's crew dived into the harbour for safety, but it was a mistake. The oil lines running along the wharf were hit, and the black liquid flowed out into the sea and caught fire. Oil enveloped the men struggling in the water, blackening them all over and making breathing difficult. Those attempting to swim had to pick their way through the flames. The destruction slowly moved across the administrative district of the town, demolishing the hospital, the post office and the telephone exchange, effectively cutting off the city's communications with the outside world. Dozens of civilians were killed or wounded and trapped in the rubble. At Government House, Abbott and his family had fled to their concrete strongroom when the sirens sounded. A 250-kilogram bomb landed in the grounds, about 15 metres from the shelter. The blast smashed in the iron door, and the shockwave lifted the concrete ceiling as the wind might lift a sail. The ceiling crashed back down, snapping the reinforced concrete pillars. Everybody in the shelter might have been killed on the spot by the falling concrete, but for the caved-in iron door, which somehow proved strong enough to support parts of the roof. Dust and tons of masonry showered into the strongroom, wrecking half of it. The raid was only 5 minutes old. The anti-aircraft guns fired back at the Japanese, but were horrified to discover that tropical heat had played tricks with fuse timers on anti-aircraft shells. The shells uselessly burst below and behind the bombers, never on target. With no fighter aircraft to challenge them, the Japanese continued on their leisurely path of destruction. Bombs poured down on the hangars and workshops at the airbase, wrecking them all, together with any aircraft inside. Fires broke out at the ammunition dump and stores. When the high-flying bombers had finished their work, the dive bombers moved in for the kill. Zeros and Vals flashed across the airfield, strafing and bombing at will. They flew low enough for the defenders to see the faces of the pilots. The machine guns did their best, but there was no stopping the smiling pilots as they roared effortlessly overhead. Soon the base was a heap of rubble, and the ammunition dumps were ablaze. Back at the port, the ship's anti-aircraft guns sent a barrage of fire up into the air as the Val dive bombers went to work. The USS Peary was their main target. 5 bombs slammed into it, including one that sliced its way into the ammunition store, triggering a catastrophic explosion that utterly wrecked the destroyer. A US sailor later recalled, quote, "The explosion was blindingly bright. When you opened your eyes, It took time to adjust so you could see again. We were dressed in shorts, with short-sleeved shirts. The Peary blast made us feel as if every uncovered part of our body was on fire." End quote. The devastated Peary slid beneath the burning waters of Darwin Harbour, its anti-aircraft guns firing to the last. 80 of her crew were killed, including her captain and all of her officers. Their next target was the William B. Preston. As the Peary was being pummeled into non-existence, the Willie B. tried to escape out into the ocean. At first they seemed to be lucky, with Japanese bombs narrowly missing them multiple times. But it couldn't last. Finally, one slammed into their deck and ignited a rack filled with ammunition. A survivor later recalled the devastation that resulted. Quote, "After the deck house lay several bodies in pieces. One man had been cut in half at the waist, and the area was covered with blood, so much that it was difficult to keep one's footing." End quote. The Willie B. was able to escape, despite the fact it was now on fire and its steering gear was crippled. The harbour was now a howling, screaming, smoke-filled tumult of dive bombers, swooping, strafing Zero fighters, exploding bombs, bursting shrapnel, spreading oil, some of it on fire, crippled or sinking ships, and men trying to stay afloat in the oily water. Then a low rumbling sound began to come from the tuna. A bomb had sliced through the ship's bridge and exploded in the saloon, killing as many as 45 of the sheltering crew. A second bomb slammed into the timber-filled No. 1 hold, setting it on fire. Now that fire was spreading through the ship, heading straight for the holes, filled with TNT and 200 tons of depth charges. Not everything was going the Japanese way. On land, a rather unlikely hero was giving them a bloody nose. Wilbert Darky Hudson had been having a shower when the sirens sounded. He rushed out to man his machine gun post, wearing just a helmet, a strategically placed towel, and some heavy boots. If only the Japanese had attacked 10 minutes later, you'd have been fully dressed instead of fighting for your life wearing just a towel. You blast away at the Japanese aircraft with your Lewis machine gun, but you haven't even given them a scratch. The Zeros swoop down, their grinning pilot sticking up 2 fingers and raking your post with bullets. When a nearby machine gunner clutches his throat and kills over dead after yet another Zero strafing run, you decide drastic measures are needed. You turn to your fellow gunner, Tex. "We're not hitting anything from here. We need to get out in the open." Setting up in a wide-open paddock, the Lewis gun supported by Tex's shoulder, you're about to pull the trigger when your towel falls down. Standing there stark naked except for your boots and helmet, a Zero swoops by so low that the pilot stares at you open-mouthed at the sight. Bloody towel. Bullets smash into the ground around you, and another Zero zooms over your new position. Tex yells, "Up his ass! Up his ass!" as you blaze away against the plane's undercarriage and rear. Black smoke is soon billowing out of the plane, and it crashes into the sea. "We shot one down," you yell at Tex. He just smiles mischievously and snarks back, "I doubt it was the bullets. Seeing you naked probably killed the poor bugger." This really happened. Darky Hudson became a local legend as the naked gunner of Darwin. That plane he downed was the first enemy aircraft to be destroyed over Australia, and he won the Military Cross. He never did live down the jokes, however. Yet it was only one of a few small victories. The Japanese pilots ruled the skies with seeming impunity, raining death down the city and the ships in its harbour. Not content with bombing Government House into the ground, Zero fighters took offence at the Australian flag still fluttering in the grounds, and set about machine-gunning it with furious enthusiasm. The flag held out gamely, though one of the stars and bits of the Union Jack were blown away. The battered flag can be seen today in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. After 42 minutes, at about 10:40 a.m, the last Japanese planes from the first wave left the skies of Darwin. The all-clear sounded. As the citizens of Darwin emerged from their shelters, they were about to be greeted by the biggest explosion of the day. The TNT on the Neptuna exploded, and a column of smoke and flames shot up into the sky, forming a gigantic mushroom cloud that blossomed over the sinking ship. Many of those in the water, and the people trying to rescue them, were vaporized. As the anti-aircraft gunners frantically restocked and rescue efforts went on, the Japanese came back. Around noon, 54 Japanese aircraft struck Darwin a second time. These were big, twin-engine bombers, and each carried a payload of 1,000 kilograms of bombs, more than 3 times the capacity of a Val, and 250 kilograms more than a Kate. They ignored the city and the port. Their target was the already battered airbase. Flying over in perfect formation, they released 13,000 kilograms of high explosive. Airmen in the trenches and shelters could feel the searing heat, deafening roar and violent pressure wave as each pattern of bombs threatened to engulf them. Soon, the base was consumed by gigantic flashes of yellow flame, followed by dense clouds of black smoke and thunderous rumbling. The whole base was reduced to an absolute ruin. No buildings were still standing. The second raid lasted only 20 minutes. The Japanese were so confident they would meet no resistance, they didn't even bring an escort of Zero fighters. And they were right. Not a single bomber was damaged. By 12:20, the raid was over. A shattered city and a terrified population needed firm leadership. But no one seemed to be in charge. Soon a call went up. Where was Administrator Abbott? Abbott's priorities in the aftermath of the raid were frankly bizarre. He commandeered 3 policemen and demanded they help load the contents of his wine cellar onto trucks to be evacuated. When that task was done, he decided the government crockery, china and glassware also needed to be saved. Darwin is a mess at this time. The harbour is a charnel house. The city is in ruins, people are beginning to panic, and a rescue effort needs to be organised. Yet Abbott is packing away his crockery and wine. It gets even worse. Darwin only had 15 policemen. In general, a day shift consisted of only 4 men. So it is utterly mad that 3 of them should, on the administrator's orders, be whipped away from the emergency policing of the town and assigned instead to packing the residency's cups and saucers. Abbott was genuinely an idiot. In the absence of any leadership, the remaining inhabitants fled the city in the soon-to-be infamous Adelaide River Stakes. How it started is the kind of story you could only get in Australia. In 1942, Darwin had no sewers, and very few houses had septic tanks. Instead, sanitary carts called dunny trucks toured the town twice a week and emptied the backyard lavatories. One of these dunny trucks were commandeered after the raid by a junior government official and has somehow acquired a passenger load of 8 prominent Darwin citizens, seated on the roof. According to legend, on its way, it failed to negotiate a particularly tricky bend and shed its entire load of full lavatory pans. As they splattered messily onto the street, the traumatized Darwinians realized they were being abandoned by the precious dunny trucks, and the mass exodus began. With a dunny truck in the lead, like some kind of smelly Pied Piper, the fleeing residents headed to Alice Springs in the interior. Only in Australia. Ironically, it was now at the levelled airbase that the most ridiculous farce occurred. 2,000 men were milling around with little to do, an obvious target for the Japanese planes if they returned. The commander decided to set a mess hall down the road and send them for lunch. There were two problems, however. Some of the men had already set off down the road, so it was too late to give them the correct order anyway, and those still at the base were scattered in sections over a huge area. Instead of calling them all together and marching them down the road in a body, which might have avoided confusion but would have exposed them to more danger, their commander allowed each section to pass the order to the next. If you've ever played Chinese Whispers as a kid, you know what's coming. The unfortunate commander later lamented that, quote, "There seems to have been varying orders transmitted. Some men appear to have been told, though by whom I cannot track down, that they were to go to Bachelor, 90 kilometres away. Some men that they had to go 5 miles down the road. Some men that they had to go half a mile down the road, and some that they had to go 22 miles. End quote. 7 men made it to the mess station out of 2,000. The rest just seemed to evaporate. They were later found all over northwest Australia. One even reached Melbourne in the southeast. It's a really good thing the Japanese didn't invade. Things were really going to get worse in the stricken city. Sergeant MacArthur Onslow of the Provost Corps, basically the military police, was drunk as a skunk on looted booze, and he marched into the police station sometime early in the afternoon after the second raid. Brandishing a revolver, he fired into the ceiling and announced that Darwin was now under martial law. Even though he was swaying on his feet and stank of alcohol, for some reason the police believed him. In actual fact, the military hadn't declared martial law. They were waiting for the civilian authorities to take charge. With no one knowing who was actually in charge, discipline broke down and mass looting began. What makes it really shameful is often military personnel who were doing the looting. Over the next few days, Darwin was picked bare. Officers' messes, which had been hot, bleak and uncomfortable the day before the raid, suddenly and mysteriously acquired electric fans, refrigerators, radios, carpets, cups and glasses, pleasant cane furniture, cushions, curtains, and all the comforts of home. Abbott's priorities remained staggeringly bad. He blamed the Chinese for the looting, even though they actually had nothing to do with it. Because of course he did. He took a small break from saving his wine collection and the government crockery to go to Chinatown just to make sure the fiendish Chinese were put off from stealing the property of whites. He really was a terrible man. The military police were now a drunken shambles, issuing contradictory orders and claiming martial law was in effect, even though it wasn't. In the vacuum created by Abbott's obsession with his crockery and the Chinese, no one could really contradict them. They did as they pleased, and this led to some truly bizarre situations. As your US Army Jeep hits yet another pothole and sees a leap up in the air, your driver, Kowalski, curses these poor outback roads. Laughing, you say, "Look on the good side. If the Japanese invade, at least the roads will slow them down." Kowalski gives you a stern stare. "Don't joke about that. They might be coming. Darwin's been badly hit. There's nothing to stop them." You continue to bicker until a bullet smashes into one of your headlights. An apparition emerges from the darkness, yelling something you don't understand and firing his gun. Bullets thud into your car as Kowalski frantically tries to turn around and head the other way. Kowalski is wild-eyed as you speed back the way you came. I told you! The Japanese have landed!" As darkness fell, reports were soon flooding in of cars being shot at, especially their headlights. Was it the Japanese? Had they invaded? Nope. The culprit was the same drunkard who had helped cause the chaos to break out after the raid, Sergeant Onslow. Along with some equally drunken military police comrades, he had taken it upon himself to shoot out the lights of passing cars, claiming they were enforcing a blackout. After he shot at some American military vehicles while yelling incoherently, The drivers breathlessly reported back that the Japanese had landed, causing yet more panic. If the raid had been marked by both heroism and tragedy, its aftermath was one of incompetence and chaos. The city was virtually deserted, mass looting had broken out, the civil police felt sidelined, and the military police were out of control. The administrators' port, sherry, and other fine wines were in safe hands. Otherwise, Darwin was a mess. The raid had been devastating. In the harbour, 9 vessels had been sunk, with 12 more badly damaged. 25 other ships in the port escaped serious damage or were untouched. 3 Catalina flying boats were also destroyed, along with 2 US Navy freighters, who were sunk northwest of Bathurst Island by valves from Hero and Sorrow. Unlike at Pearl Harbour, where Nagumo's airmen failed to hit fuel stocks, repair facilities, and other storage installations, these were thoroughly destroyed in the Darwin raid. The Japanese airmen had learnt from their previous mistakes. More bombs had been dropped on Darwin and more ships sunk in the harbour than at Pearl Harbour, though its death toll was much lower. 191 were killed and more than 400 wounded. About 68 of the dead and injured were civilians. The Japanese lost just 7 planes during the whole raid. Darwin had been eliminated as an Allied supply and transport base from which aid to the Dutch East Indies could be delivered. Along with the capture of Timor, the raid doomed Java. It was soon overrun by the seemingly invincible Japanese. One of the most controversial parts of the raid is, did the Australian government deliberately cover it up afterwards? On one hand, Australian newspapers were filled with news of the first attack on Australia since European settlement. On the other hand, these reports claimed there hadn't been much damage or loss of life. What was going on? The problem may have rested with a certain administrator, that great protector of crockery and wine, Abbott. He was telegraphing in Canberra, claiming everything was fine. He apparently wished to conceal from his masters the extent to which he had allowed the town to fall into chaos. By the time the truth had been discovered, the Australian government had a lot to worry about. Singapore had fallen, further air raids were hitting other North Australian towns, an invasion seemed a distinct possibility. They stuck with the previous story, and Darwin never became a rallying cry like Pearl Harbour did for the US. The Japanese assault on Darwin did not end with the 2 raids of 19th of February. Over the next 21 months, the town faced no fewer than 64 attacks by Japanese bombers. The onslaught ended with a final raid on the 12th of November 1943. None of the subsequent raids ever matched the scale or ferocity of the first. The attacks were part of a largely forgotten air war in northern Australia that involved no fewer than 97 attacks on the region's cities. Darwin would be rebuilt and would become a major supply hub in the war again, particularly for Allied operations against the Japanese forces in the Indies. Australia's air defences would improve, and eventually the once arrogant Japanese Imperial Air Force would end its raids on northern Australia as they had become too costly. Abbott wasn't sacked, unfortunately, though he was criticised by an investigation into his conduct. He also came in for a lot of local criticism for not staying in Darwin after the raid. Instead, he was hiding out in Alice Springs. He had no real authority anymore, apart from being able to stop Darwin's Chinatown from being rebuilt. While the raid on Darwin is being taught more widely now in Australia, it's still relatively forgotten. In 2020, a survey found that only 3% of the public knew the true extent of the bombing of Darwin. That Australian guy I met in the bar 2 years ago really sums it up. In his own words, he'd only vaguely heard of it. Darwin, however, has rediscovered its wartime history, both the tragedy and the heroism. It has become a centrepiece of its tourism industry and a source of civic pride. My favourite discovery was that Darky Hudson now has a gym named after him, the Naked Gunner, a well-deserved honour. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In the next episode, we're covering one of the craziest conflicts of the Cold War. In East Africa, America's ally Ethiopia has plunged into communist revolution, while its Soviet-supporting neighbour, Somalia, hungrily eyes its territory. What starts as a regional war will lead to the superpowers swapping sides mid-conflict. An intervention by Castro's Cuba that would stabilize East Africa right up until present day. Join me for the Ogden War. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.